All right, good afternoon, and welcome to the Geology Brown Bag. Linda is not here today, so I get to introduce myself. So today's speaker is Chuck Bailey. He's a great guy, and he's going to be talking to you about some of his research in Oman. And we're trying something new this semester, and hopefully going forward in the future semesters in the brown bag. What we're going to try to do in the brown bag is have one faculty present every semester. And part of our rationale for doing this is that we spend a lot of energy and time trying to create new knowledge about the Earth in this department. That is, we do research and we actually publish on that research. And sometimes I think that we're not even aware of what's going on around us with what people are doing. So I thought that it would be good for our community to have a brown bag that was kind of focused on what faculty have done. And then potentially this would be a segue for people who think about doing research and other things like that. So I have to put my money where my mouth is and get it rolling. And then in future semesters, you'll be hearing from other faculty about this. So I want to talk to you today about basically a very curious and weird rock from Oman. And it is, in essence, I thought, time to talk about this because earlier this fall, we just had a paper come out in Earth and Planetary Science Letters. In fact, if I click the slide, boom, here is the title of that. And so I'm excited to finally have this stuff sort of see the light of day scientifically in the peer-reviewed literature. So my colleagues on this are Andreas, and Andreas is German, but he works in Oman, and he is the size of a giant. All right. And he is first author. We shared a lot of the work here, but he was a younger faculty member coming up for tenure, and it made more sense to make him first author than someone old and long in the tooth like I am. And then we had collaborators both in South Africa and Sweden who worked on this project. So it's been fun to have some international co-conspirators to work with. So let's set the stage for what the geology of Oman is like and what makes it special. And I want to go back 90 million years ago to a time when there was the Tethys Ocean or seaway, and Arabia was here, and out in the middle of that seaway, there was a subduction zone. And that subduction zone was actually subducting under ocean crust and into below a mid-ocean ridge, okay? And what happened that makes the geology in Oman ridiculously interesting is that this rock right here, which is from the mantle, and it's got the big O there for Ophiolite, is going to end up over here on top of these shallow marine carbonates on the continental crust. All right, so this collision effectively led to the emplacement of this stretch of ocean crust and mantle onto continental crust. And that happens very infrequently. Typically, we like to think the fate of ocean crust is to actually be subducted. But in this instance, the oceanic mantle and the crustal section was abducted and actually ends up being tectonically emplaced over continental crust. And geodynamically, that should be difficult. It should be difficult because mantle rocks are quite dense. Continental rocks are considerably less so. So if we zoom in a little more, what we see in Oman today is this vast sheet of Ophiolite, which is in purple, which is in tectonic contact with continental rocks, which are here in the browns and the light blues. So I first went to Oman because I had learned long ago about the Oman Ophiolite, the world's biggest Ophiolite. It's massive and it's spectacularly well preserved in the desert. And I wanted to go look at the base of this fault because this has to be a whopper of a fault to actually bring together rocks that were once in the mantle at 40 or 50 kilometers with shallow marine limestones like some of you swam over and on when you were in the Bahamas. So that's how I got going when I went to Oman to study the Ophiolite and the base, which is called the Samael Fault. But sometimes things happen when you do science that you don't expect. So we have done a lot of work in Oman, and a lot of that work has been on the Ophiolite. So here, Musa and Sisi that are with me here, looking at a shear zone at the base of the Ophiolite, and these are tectonic blocks of oceanic or mantle peridotite that have been sheared in a fault zone. And so they've been completely ripped up. These are all recrystallized serpentinites. And so we've done a lot of work on that. But from the very first time I was in Oman, I noticed that there were these curious and interesting red rocks. And these red rocks, we oftentimes have to walk around or over to get to the Ophiolite. and I had no interest at all in these rocks. Zero, none. And this rock is known as Listwaenite. And even the spelling of Listwaenite is controversial, all right? I have a few samples here that you can pass around of the Listwaenite. These came all the way from Oman. And send them down the line. And you'll see there's a variety of textures in these rocks. So what the heck is this Listwaenite, you say? Well, it's very obvious and evident when you look at it in the field and from space. So here is a satellite image, and the darker terrain here is underlain by the ophiolite, the mantle rocks, very well exposed. The light colored rocks here are the shallow water carbonates. And then if you look a little more closely, you'll see that there are these things that are kind of reddish. And that is the Listwaenite. In fact, here's a geologic map of that same location, kind of superimposed upon it. And in the bright sort of reddish pink color here are these bands of Listwaenite. So you're sitting there saying, I've never heard of such rock, Chuck. What is this rock? And it's good to learn on Family Weekend Friday sometimes. So I'll tell you what a Listwaenite is. It is inferred to be a fully carbonated peridotite. And maybe we should back up since this is a brown bag. What is a peridotite? It is an ultramafic igneous rock. It's composed typically of olivine and pyroxene and maybe a little chromite. It's got a lot of magnesium in it, very low silica. And in essence, these Listwaenites are inferred to have formed by basically adding a tremendous amount of carbon or carbon dioxide to these peridotites and altering the mineralogy. And so the mineralogy consists of really very few things. It's got magnesite. Anybody know what magnesite is? Big magnesium mineral, all right? And quartz, so that's our SiO2. Dolomite is a magnesium calcium carbonate. And then there's some accessory minerals like chromium spinel and iron oxide. The iron oxide is maybe what makes the rock so reddish, but it's a really cool looking rock. It's very tough, it's very durable, and it's in a lot of places in Oman. The other thing about Listwaenite, which makes it interesting, is that a number of authors, and in fact, a whole team of researchers, have inferred that this carbonation occurred in the mantle during the collision in which you emplaced the ophiolite. And this has led to lots of people saying that Listwaenites form in the mantle wedge and involve deep carbon storage. And deep carbon storage is something that is very sexy right now in the world's, well, it's probably sexy for like 50 people in the world. But the idea is, how much carbon do we store deep in the earth? And is the mantle a repository for a significant amount of carbon? And these authors say, oh yeah, man, that's exactly what's going on down there. You are doing this in the mantle at very great depths. So, okay, that's out there. That's been published in a number of studies. I'm going to try to offer a different hypothesis for how this forms. And it turns out Listwaenite, no one even agrees on the spelling. All of these are ways that it's been spelled. And the reason this is out there is originally it came from the Cyrillic alphabet, and then it was basically Latinized. It was first described by Rose for a magnesite-bearing quartz rock in the Ural Mountains, and that was how it was spelled. But then Murchison, who was English, spells it this way for a place called Larch Hill in the southern Urals. So in the literature, you will see it spelled this way, this way, this way, this way, all the same rock. And reviewers get upset if you spell it the way that they don't like. In fact, we spell it this way, and one of the reviewers said that was because we were chauvinistic Germans. And I'm like, dude. So there you go, Listwaenite. So my purpose today with this talk is to give you a sense of the field relation, the kinematics, a kind of a teaser with the microstructures, and then some new geochronology we have on the Listwaenite, which occurs associated with the ophiolite. And what I'm going to do is propose a model that has both a different tectonic setting and timing from what has been proposed in the literature. So let's zoom in to where we're going to be. So Oman, beautiful country in Eastern Arabia. If you want to go there, we're running a study abroad program in January. We'd love to have you. And we're going to be in the North Oman Mountains. And the North Oman Mountains exposed old rock in these domes. So this is the Jebel Akhtar dome and the Sahat dome to the east. And then everything in green is effectively the Ophiolite. So when I first went to Oman, this was the geologic contact that I was really excited about studying. Should be vastly important. We're going to zoom into this narrow area, kind of a saddle between the two domes. And here's a geologic map of that. On the map, you can see Ophiolite in green. And there's mantle Ophiolite. There's the crustal bit of the Ophiolite. And you also hopefully can see that I've illustrated Listwaenite in red. And take a look at where the Listwaenite occurs. It seems to occur in these linear packages associated with faults. It has basically Ophiolite on one side of it, but oftentimes it has other rocks that are associated with it there. So one of the things that I'm going to tell you is that sort of spatially, the Listwaenite is commonly associated with faults. Now, for those of you who maybe are looking at the explanation here on the left, notice that symbology right there? That's an extensional fault, a normal fault. And that's actually where we see the Listwaenite localized. So 3 different locations that we have as sort of study sites. And let's go to the first one called Buwa. And at Buwa, we basically find Listwaenite sitting adjacent to faults. And then in these curious little things like this, these little patches. And what the heck is that? Well, cross-section view, right, with that third dimension. So we see the Listwaenite sitting in the hanging wall of faults above ophiolitic rocks. And we also see them in these zones, just little tiny, they're almost like little patches or blisters of Listwaenite with faults all around them. For those of you who like stereonets, how many of you like stereonets in the room? You're going to like them if you take structure. You'll like them when you take structure. This is showing the orientation of many of these structures here. So we know, because we are on these structures, we can see the kinematics, that these are normal faults. They slipped with the hanging wall moving down. And that's in contrast to what we would infer for the original emplacement of the Ophiolite. We would have predicted it would have been a great thrust fault or a reverse fault. Here is a picture in the field. They're carbonate rocks in the back, they're quartzites, they're amphibolites, and then there are these little slivers of the dark red Listwaenite. And all of these heavy lines are actually tectonic contacts, places where the rocks have been sheared and slid past one another. So one of our field findings is that Listwaenite is exposed in a set of, basically, it's always in tectonic contact with other rocks. There are always faults that are bound in it. And some of these are things we call extensional duplexes. So that's an observation from field work. Here are some field pictures to give you a sense of some of the structures that we look at. So these are some quartzites and what are referred to as the metamorphic soul. But can you see the trajectory of the fabric in that rock? It sort of is warped. And the trajectory of that indicates to us that that has got a hanging wall down or normal sense of motion. And here in this strongly sheared serpentinite, there are blocks of relic peridotite, effectively, and there are ample signs of shearing in that particular way. So normal sense shearing, another observation. So we're going to move now to another location. I think we're going over here next. Where are we going now? Good question, you say. Yeah, we're going there. Voila. And this is pretty spectacular when you look at it in satellite imagery. Look at those red rocks. They're completely a lot of red rocks that are out there. And we have places where the Listwaenite is here and there's peridotite there. We have metamorphic soul. These are like phyllites and quartzites, just sort of metamorphic rocks. And then we have these little patches of Listwaenite sitting on top of those. Over here, we have more of the Listwaenite. And, oh, I need to go back. This is important. This was a deep core hole that was drilled as part of a scientific drilling program. And the people who've written about the Listwaenite being formed in the mantle draw almost all of their conclusions from the data from this particular hole. So they had rock core, and they really didn't actually go examine the rocks in the field on the mountain behind them. this is an important picture to me. This is the last photo I took in Oman before the pandemic hit. And this is of the famous petrologist from Indiana University. His name is Bob Winch. And he sounds like the Joker when he talks. And ever since I was a grad student, anytime I go in the field with him, he's usually, yeah, you didn't think about that. Anyway, but this is kind of a treasured photo I have during the dark days. But I took Bob out to see the Listwaenite, which you can see right here behind him. And what we observed in this particular region is the Listwaenite forms tabular bodies that are bound by faults. And this is actually a clippet, which is a tectonically isolated block. And we found in this region there are generations of both normal faults and oblique strike slip faults, along which we see the Listwaenite. Let me show you some field pictures to see if you sort of believe that, buy into that. So here is the contact with Listwaenite where the hammer is. That might be Rowan's rock hammer, don't tell her. And then this is a fault zone, and then this is serpentinized peridotite above it. That's definitely a tectonic contact. The pencil is sitting here on slicken lines. Oh, here's another example of Listwaenite, very strongly slicken lined right there. And if you measure the orientations, you can produce beach ball diagrams and learn something about the kinematics. So, all right, that's pretty interesting in and of itself. And this is what we think it looks like in cross-section view at this location. Listwaenite is in red. And what I'm trying to draw your attention to is that we have Listwaenite along a series of low-angle normal faults that are in contact with different things. Sometimes the metamorphic soil, sometimes the ophiolite. And then these are actually truncated by actually steeper, younger faults in many instances. So maybe multiple generations of faults that have sort of sliced and diced the deck here. The other thing is that the rocks of the metamorphic soil, which are kind of the bits in between the ophiolite and the continental rocks, are metamorphosed and very strongly deformed. You see these beautiful, complicated folds that are in there? Yeah, that is some significant deformation. We don't actually see any of that in the Listwaenite. It never actually has that style of deformation. Here is the inferred interpretation from the drill hole. So here is where the drill was. It went through Listwaenite, peridotite, Listwaenite, and back. And they just view the peridotite and the Listwaenite as being in bands with no tectonic contact between them. They think that it occurs kind of in sequence there with this alteration pattern. So that's a very different interpretation because everywhere we see those contacts on the surface, we can demonstrate they are tectonic contacts. All right, last sort of field location is here to the north near Fonja. And this is an important location because we've got Listwaenite here. And then you see this pinkish colored material? These are Cretaceous sedimentary rocks of the Al Hood formation. They are conglomerates and they are sandstones, and they are younger than the ophiolite. They were deposited after the ophiolite had been in place 90 million years ago. These rocks are probably on the order of like 68 million years. And what we find in this instance is that these Cretaceous rocks are actually in a half graben, bound by a big normal fault. And the footwall contains the ophiolite and the metamorphic soil and things like that. But in this big normal fault, what do we have? Listwaenite. We actually have Listwaenite. There is some crazy cool stuff that you can see here. In fact, here's an outcrop photo. And what you've got is Listwaenite on the left. You have the Al Hood formation. These are the gray is actually the Cretaceous sediments. And there are veins and dikelets of Listwaenite that are cutting that. So I'm going to pause for a second here. If this rock, the Al Hood formation, is Cretaceous and is cut by veins and dikes of Listwaenite, the Listwaenite can't be older than the Al Hood formation. Pretty simple, straightforward field relations. So the microstructures on these rocks are fabulous. In fact, if someone wanted to do a project on that, some of these Listwaenites are very much brecciated and broken. There are lots of veins that have secondary carbonate that is precipitated. And I don't understand some of these growth patterns that are in there, but the microstructures are fabulous. We have a whole suite of these just down the hall. All right, a little more eye candy on the thin sections here. A lot of carbonate minerals. There's also quartz in here. And again, like I said, there are just whole textures here that I don't fully understand. But it looks like these listwanites formed when the rock was effectively brecciated. You allowed lots of fluids to move in, magnesium-rich fluids, and you replace things there. You're growing these weird carbonate crystals, and then you've got here, these are almost like ooids that are nucleating on some kind of opaque mineral. So the texture has not been well studied. But the fact that this rock contains ample carbonate veins is pretty cool, because there's a technique that allows us to actually nowadays date calcite and potentially other carbonates using uranium lead dating. Uranium lead dating is common when we have minerals like zircon, which have a lot of uranium in it. But as techniques have gotten better and better, we are now able to potentially date the little tiny amount of uranium that it forms in calcite. It's complicated and it's not always easy, and the answers aren't always clean. But what we did is we dated about 7 or 8 different samples using this uranium lead calcite dating technique. And this was all done at the lab in South Africa. And the plot that I'm showing here is a Terra Wasserberg plot. You don't need to understand that right now. Jim Cassidy may not let you out of the room if you don't get it fully right. But suffice it to say, the spread of these data allow us to basically put on a intercept. And where that intercept hits this line, we get some sense of the age of the formation of these minerals. So let's cut to the chase. This listwanite gave us an age of 44.5 million years. Some gave very young ages. And this is like very bad data, or a very broad spread in the data, but it's a young age nonetheless. Here are a few other ones. This is a dolomite vein that's cutting the listwanite, 63 MA, 55 MA. But all of these ages are effectively Cenozoic in age, younger than the emplacement of the ophiolite and the whole mantle wedge thing. So our argument here is that the listwanite did not form in the mantle, and it did not form during the collision in which the ophiolite arrived at Oman. What we're arguing for is the listwanite formed during multiple episodes of extension, transtension, and effectively uplift of the mountain range in Oman. So this is a younger phenomena that's forming during this uplift phase in this part of the world. So these post-date all of the ophiolite tectonics. They would have developed in the upper crust, not in the deep crust or the deep mantle section here. So these are Cenozoic features formed really due to tectonism and fluid flow in this environment. So with that, I'm going to kind of leave you with the conclusions. The listwanite, crazy weird rock, spatially associated with extensional faults. We think that there were multiple episodes of generating these weird rocks. And I would argue that we need to reconsider this idea that these rocks are from the deep mantle and serve as some nice analog for how the mantle stores carbon. All right, thanks for your attention. And yeah, let's open it up for questions. Right. Quite possibly. Like I said, we have a bunch of them as thin sections already. We may collect more when we're there this year, but they really are fascinating rocks. And I think that understanding the microstructures is a whole project in and of itself. The student who worked with me on this was Eric. And effectively, we got thin sections and then the pandemic arrived. So he really never had the time, because he couldn't get in the building, to study them, but he had great field relations. So, he had a very legit thesis. Oh, all right. Let's see. Maybe, let me do this. I wonder if it's like Peter Kellerman in the chat saying you're wrong. Oh, it's Terry. All right, any other questions in the room with those I can see? Good.
Can you also use iron, the phase of the iron as an argument? Because the first thing that strikes me is the iron is all oxide. That's not something that would be like associated with the mantle formation. So I'm surprised that you can classify mantle. Did you use iron oxide to get sort of oxidate and save iron part?
I think that's a good point. We didn't really sort of hammer that home, but yeah, I mean, these are rusty red rocks.
Yeah.
as opposed to having that iron in a reduced state in some other fashion. With the original work that was done on it, they tried to do sort of thermometry and barometry. And the thermometry says it's low temperature, right? Under 200 degrees Celsius. But that's okay. You expect in a subduction zone in a mantle wedge, it would still be low temperature. They then calculated a pressure that they thought was really deep, like 40 kilometers. But their uncertainty with their geobarometry was like plus or minus 20 kilometers. So in some ways, I just say take it with a grain of salt. The temperature is what could be the same in both models. Extension with high fluid flow. All right, awesome. Well, thanks for being here. I hope many of you will join us later today at the Keck Lab, the lovely early autumn day in Williamsburg, and we're going to be there for our family weekend dinner this evening. All right.